Welcome everyone to tonight's J. Sherwood McGinnis Jr. War, Peace, and Justice Project session titled The Utility of Force. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'd like to talk just a little bit about the symposium as a brief introduction. I see many familiar faces here, so thank you for joining us again. And for those that are new, I hope you will find this journey worthwhile. And the purpose of the symposium project is to illuminate the human drama of conflict and war's impact on society, especially our veterans and their families. And of course, the indigenous population that conflict occurs. Of course, the ongoing crisis in Ukraine, which you're all very familiar with. War comes at a terrible cost in life, national treasure and blood. And so one of the questions we ask the community is, what do you as Americans expect from the expenditure of national treasure and blood? And I think that's a discussion that should be had after going through the longest war in U.S. history, that being Afghanistan from 2001. And we just recognized the one-year anniversary from the withdrawal from Afghanistan in August of this year. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our special guest tonight, Sir General Rupert Smith. And what I'd like to do is just read a very quick bio. It's quite extensive, it's quite a career. General Sir Rupert Smith is a senior international authority on defense, security, strategy, and geopolitics. And I also would add to that the quintessential international expert on the use of force. He has been a member of the Strategic Advice Panel to the United Kingdom Chief of Defense and was the only military member of the United Kingdom National Security Forum, advising the Prime Minister and the Cabinet between 2008 and 2010. General Smith retired from the British Army on 20 January 2002. His last appointment was NATO Deputy Supreme Commander, Allied Powers Europe, 1998 to 2001, covering the Alliance's Balkan operations, including the Kosovo bombing, and the development of the European Security and Defense Identity, known as ESDI. His book, The Utility of Force, The Art of War in the Modern World, was first published in 2005 and has remained in print ever since, with an updated second edition issued in 2019. Defined as seminal by reviewers and practitioners alike, it has been translated into 9 languages, including Indonesian, Japanese, and Korean. Born in 1943, he was educated at Hailbury and at ISC and the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. He enlisted in 1962 and was commissioned in the Parachute Regiment in 1964. I'd also like to add that his father is a World War II veteran. General Smith is a senior advisor to the J. Sherwood McGinnis Jr. War, Peace, and Justice Project, Carlisle, Pennsylvania. General Sir Rupert Smith.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Before I talk about the book, I perhaps should explain how it got into print. The book was written to some extent out of frustration. Not, as you might think, with the people who commanded me and directed me over the years, but because at the end of my service, all sorts of people were asking me, including some publishers, if I would write a book. And I kept saying I didn't want to write a book, because what they had in mind was the sort of kiss and tell book that so many senior people write after they've left the service to show why they were wonderful or whatever it was. And I've never believed anything I've read in those books, so I didn't want to write one myself. But after some reflection, I realized there was something I wanted to say, but it wasn't to the army or the other military services. It was to the people who employed me, the politicians, the senior officials, and the people I represented. And it was born of the realization that although I'd served for 40 years, about half of that time on operations or directly supporting an operation, Um, I had never gone on these operations. In the organisation I had trained for. There was always a new organisation for that operation. And we never used the equipment we'd been training on, that people had spent a lot of money providing, for the purpose it had been purchased for. We were I'm not talking about the rifle or the grenade, but the other expensive stuff. We were not using it for that purpose. We were having to think of a new way to use this weapon. And this was a characteristic of every one of my deployments and operations we've been on. And I had formed, during the last sort of half of my service, a view as to what this was. I didn't formulate it in the argument that I will present to you in a moment in quite that way, but I had thought of this word, or words, the utility of force. Why am I here? I can't do what I'm being told to do because force can't achieve that object, was the sort of thought that I was saying. And hence, the idea of we don't understand the utility of force was in my head from somewhere in the middle 90s onwards. The idea of war amongst the people, which I also introduced into the book, was an idea that came when I was deployed in Rhodesia as it was becoming Zimbabwe. And you saw a defeated ethnic group, the Rhodesians, the Zimbabweans in ascendancy, three armies in play in the field, and suddenly you had to think about war and the use of force in a completely different way. And one of the guerrilla armies had been trained by the Russians and their acolytes, and the other guerrilla army had been trained by the Chinese and the North Koreans and their acolytes, and you had this clash of military philosophies, as well as the Western philosophy that represented by the Rhodesians. And that's in 79, 83, 80 to 83, and I start to use this idea in my head of war amongst the people as opposed to industrial war. So that's the genesis of the book. That's the audience it was written for. If it had been left to me and my wife hadn't intervened, you would have got a short pamphlet in military speak, and I wouldn't be standing here talking to you. She forced me to stop assuming knowledge and to develop an argument for the audience I was trying to write for, and assisted me with where commas go, which has never been a strong point in my education. So there it is. That's why I'm here talking to you about a book, The Utility of Force. What I propose to do is to tell you the thesis of the book, as I think I've written it, some of the supporting elements of the thesis only in headlines, and then lay it open to your questions. And it would take me away from the book. We don't have to only talk about that. And I'm yours for the next 2 hours, and develop it as you wish. When I finish this little introductory point, I'll give you about 6 headings, which I've learned from experience, cover a lot of the major points that people ask me questions about. You do not have to follow them. It is merely there because that's what's happened to me in the past. So, in short order, the thesis is this: that in the past, when faced by a political disagreement, confrontation, that we could not resolve by debate, negotiation, and so forth, we turned to the use of armed force. And we understood that by using the armed force, the outcome would resolve the matter, and we would have got our way or not, as the case may be. And we understood there was a process, a situation we called peace, and you moved from peace to something called crisis. Remember crisis management? The academic ink that was spilt on crisis management? I haven't heard it for about 20 years. Then we went to, the crisis developed into war. You had the war, you then arrived at resolution and peace. And we structured our laws, our thought processes on that process. We had the draft, you called people up, and you had reserves, you could call them up and so forth. This was how we thought of war and the use of force. But that hasn't worked. We haven't done it. Even Mr. Putin is only half doing it. He's not at war, he's got a special operation. And I'm not calling any of the conscripts up until it's about now in the annual cycle, unless we have a short emergency, so we'll call up some old ones. But he's not actually using that process. And none of us have. In fact, after Vietnam, Uncle Sam stopped it as far as conscription and so forth was concerned. And we've replaced that industrial form of war, where the whole society entered into the object, your whole industrial and peoples were devoted to this one endeavour, which is how the First, Second World War, the First World War, and so forth, all the way back to Napoleon, had constructed the idea of the citizen at war. We've replaced it for what I've called war amongst the people. And the characteristic of war amongst the people is that you do not achieve the result by armed force. The most armed force can do is to create the condition in which, by other means, you achieve your objective. And if you don't match your use of armed force with those other means, you arrive at the all-too-observable phenomena that you can win every battle and lose the war. Because war and battle are not synonyms. And yet we treat them as such. And our old paradigm, the one of industrial war, allowed us to think of war and battle as a single entity. But they're not. And one of the things we might like to enlarge on subsequently is the difference between the two, and why they're different, and why in our world today these two are really very separate activities. We think of terrorism. The battle with the terrorist may be only 4 men in a ditch. It may be a vehicle being blown up. It may be 6 loons with guns on the street in Paris killing 140 people. Those are battles. But where do they sit in the war? And that's what we can't manage at the moment, because our institutions, and here I refer to our capitals, whether it's Washington or London or anywhere, our institutions, our military structures, our international organisations that we form to manage these things, NATO, UN, etc. The institutions were all born with the previous paradigm. And their structures and processes are part of the previous paradigm. And until we change our institutions, particularly their thought process, we will not triumph in war amongst the people. So that was the thesis in essence. I must bring in the sainted Clausewitz, because you mustn't talk about these subjects unless we refer to Clausewitz at some point. So I'll get him in and over with at the moment. Clausewitz had a very useful discussion about the characteristics of war, and he divides them into the nature of war and the character of war. And then I am talking about the character of war. In his formulation and my interpretation, of course, the nature of war largely refers to battle. The character of war refers to war. And in the book, in order to try and break this war and battle being synonyms in many people's minds, I use the words confrontation and conflict. Confrontation to encompass the war, the political essence of what is going on, and conflict to cover the fighting, whether it's those 4 men in a ditch trying to blow up your car on the road into Afghanistan, all the way to full-scale armed formations moving around on a battlefield. Those are all fighting. That's all conflict. And it's as nasty and as frightening and as exciting and fulfilling for some as it's ever been and will continue to be. For my part, that bit of it is deep in the human personality, nature, and all the rest of it. And we might like to talk about that as well. But that's battle. That isn't war, and the book's about war, not battle. As the professional, I do the war. I'm like the bricklayer. I'll build you a brick wall and so forth. But for my employers, the people, the politicians, the officials, they're the people who want the wall built. They don't have to tell me how to lay the bricks. They have to tell me what they want it to cost and where it's to go and so on and so forth. And that's what the book's about. So in the book, and here's a problem of talking about a book that you wrote or published 17 years ago, and the essence of it is nearly 20 years old, that the examples you use and the setting of it in your mind is of the situation at that time. And of course, 20 years later, a lot of things have moved on. And so if I wrote it again, I wouldn't explain some of the things with the examples that I have now. And one of the tools I've tried to use was I called it trends, to contrast the industrial war with the war amongst the people. And to draw examples, contemporary examples, to show the difference. It was to show the characteristics of the new paradigm. And I've given myself a little exercise in thinking through those trends against what's going on now. And again, these are talking points if you want me to cover them. But the 6 trends were that the objectives of the war in war amongst the people are malleable. They are soft. They're like soap in a bath. You can't quite get hold of them. And you're watching Mr. Putin suffering from the malleable aim. He doesn't actually, he's declared one objective, he's now declaring another, and so forth. So what is the object? We, in the collective West, we have yet to work it out, it's so malleable. We can't even find it in the soapy water as we look for this aim. And that is, go and look at the record. I can certainly do it for the UK. The parliamentary record of statements by government ministers as to the objectives of the British forces in Afghanistan is an appallingly sad read. It's about an A4 sheet, closely written and with dates on it, because they change all the time, these objectives. And for the whole of our deployment, and not one of them was achieved. And I dare you, go and look at the record in Washington and see how close that little description is. I don't know. But what we think are the objectives are not hard, definitive objectives. They're soft and malleable. And it goes on all the time. This isn't saying it's wrong. That's how it is. The second characteristic is that these wars amongst the people are conducted by non-states. There's states in the mix, but either there is a non-state like ISIS, or the IRA, or ETA, or whatever. There's a non-state in there, but there are also collections of states. And the war, as opposed to the fighting, is being conducted by some multinational organisation. There's very good reasons for this. It spreads the risk, it gets more resources, etc., etc., etc. There's nothing, it's not wrong, but it makes directing the war extremely difficult. And again, you might like to talk to me about being a commander in these circumstances. The third characteristic is it takes place amongst the people. It takes place amongst the people literally. In most cases, it's literally there amongst them. And secondly, it takes place in the theatre of war. And whoever called it a theatre of war or theatre of operations all those decades ago was very prescient, because it's now become a drama that is conducted through the television, through the media, through the social media, and the whole thing is going on in this setting all the time, and it affects how you win or fight the war as opposed to the battles. Those three I still think are there. I'd use different examples to what I produced in the book, but I think they're there. The other three were more technical, more military, if you like. One was that these wars are timeless. In industrial war, because you had subordinated the whole of your society to this endeavour, you wanted to go back to that thing, peace, and you wanted it to win and win quick. So that's how you understood what you were doing. This isn't how you understand war amongst the people. And you watch Russia at the moment. It's playing it long. And it's been playing it long ever since April, when it discovered that it wasn't going to be a quick war. And every terrorist organisation is playing it long. The victory is a very distant prospect. Second to last characteristic is that you fight not to lose the force. Now, I can't say I'm witnessing this in the case of Ukraine and Russia, but generally, in my experience and observation, is that because you don't have an industrial base or the conscription, you can't afford to lose the force. And this colours the way you conduct the operation. And it may be colouring the way the Kremlin is now conducting the operation. I don't know, I can't be sure, but that's possible. And the last one is the weakest, is that you find new uses for the old organisations and weapons. I don't think that's the case anymore, because we've moved on from that state of being taken by surprise by war amongst the people. So that's 6 things you might like to think about. And then to finish, what I've been saying has certain consequences which you might recognise over the last 20 or so years. The difficulty of analysis and explanation of what is actually happening. Speak to any journalist and they find it so difficult to explain what's happening. And they default to the soldier as a victim or the pity of war. Think of all the television coverage you've seen and so forth. It almost always defaults to the pity of war and the soldier as a victim. Hasn't got the right kit, whatever it is. The second is the problem of foreseeing the effect of some action in the conflict on the confrontation. Because the confrontation is the context in which that conflict is taking place. And as I said, our institutions are very bad at linking the two. The difficulty that alliances, both the formal and the informal, have in working together and arriving at any operational direction or strategy. The application of the law, be it international treaty law or humanitarian law or domestic law. And the way you use force and the means you use in that action have a direct effect on the confrontation. Use the wrong weapon in the wrong way, and you can screw up this operation overnight. Because that all plays into that theatre, that drama of the theatre of war. So to finish, like I said, there were 6 sort of headings that people asked questions about. The difference between war and battle, we can do all that. The nature of armed force, what can it do? What does it do? Where's it bad? Where's it good? Our relationships with the other, because they're different in the fight to the confrontation. How do we understand them? The difference between defence and security. Since in many cases we engage in these operations thinking it's for our defence, when it generally isn't. It's about something else in our concepts of our security. The relationships with one's allies, formal and informal. To explain, a formal ally would be a member of NATO. An informal ally is probably the Afghan militia in that particular valley at that particular time. Or the people delivering the food and building of the schools. They're all part of your operation. It's informal, but you're working together to some common end. And we're bad at managing that. And then lastly, the business of theatre direction. It's the direction you apply in the theatre of operations, but also how do you direct the drama? So, as I say, don't have to stick to my agenda. I've laid out my stall. You're welcome to attack any of it or ask me questions of another nature.
In your talk tonight and in earlier sessions that I've been to,
Yeah.
a theme seems to be an involvement of the citizenry and with interest in what's happening militarily. And when you're describing the war with people, is that come into play at all? I mean, that citizen participation and
Yes. Let me try and answer that this way. Let's take a situation, let's take Afghanistan as an example. Now, the intervening force, us, NATO, whatever we want to call it. And here's I'm showing the difference between war and battle. If you're working your way up this valley and your leading vehicle is blown up and people are shooting at you, you are in a conflict. It doesn't matter if this man over there is a citizen or not, he's shooting at you. And so you are in a fight and there is one outcome and you wish it to be yours, that you win. But in doing it, you've, and your relationship with that opponent is like a boxing match, you win or lose. Now, all around are other citizens. If you suppose that all of them are in the same enemy camp as that chap, which is very tempting, very easy to do, you may now be making the situation a great deal worse. Because at the level of those citizens, you're in not a match of, like a boxing match, you're in a competition with some other authority, the Taliban, whatever, for the loyalty, the following, the support of those people. And if you damage in any way your ability to engage with those people, you start to achieve the man's who shot at you's objective. And so your relationship with those citizens is one of competition. They're the object you're searching for. Putin is in the same relationship. He is trying to control, re-educate, take under his control the Ukrainian citizens. And he's done it in such a way, he's managed to make it absolutely certain he hasn't got it. So he's now having to do it in these occupied areas by shipping them out. He's doing ethnic cleansing. And you can do ethnic cleansing, it's illegal and so forth, but that's one way of solving your problem and getting citizens you want there. Does that answer?
Yes, actually it's a better answer than my question.
And this business of your relationship with the other is, I've raised this as a heading, that's the essence of it. You have a relationship in a battle which is adversarial, and you want to win it. But the manner of the winning has a direct relationship on that confrontational space where you are in a competition, one of rivalry, like a running race. You share the objective. The Taliban and us, the good guys, we were in competition for the loyalty of the people, and we lost it in spades. And it's a different relationship. And every time we look at it, you see it's important to break out those two things. Why I keep saying war and battle are different. Is that stimulating enough?
No, that's a really good answer. I understand what you're saying. I'm just thinking about the United States today and the idea that the citizenry has an interest in what's going on militarily around the world. And even in the United States, there's certainly divisions. You know, everybody knows the United States is politically divided.
Mm-hmm.
And is there conflict between those two factions in support of military actions that the United States is engaged with?
Let me answer it with my own people,
Yeah.
who I hope I know better. But and I'm on less dangerous political ground than discussing someone else's country. When the Prime Minister Blair, against the vocal and demonstrable by demonstration resistance of the population, committed us to Iraq, he made a cardinal sin of lying to the people. Nothing as bad as Mr. Johnson, but getting on that way in this case. And the result was that there was no popular support for the Iraq operation. Mm-hmm. And you can see it on the ground. The Brits get in there, then they're on the back foot from then on. We're poor performance. We constantly not reinforcing and so on and so forth. And eventually Blair makes a deal with essentially with America, but through with all the other allies, that we the Brits will pull out, but we will go to Afghanistan, which we thought was a safer bet and would be more popular on the streets in London. It wasn't. And the sorry performance is fundamentally based on a complete lack of popular will to pursue this endeavour. And and the appalling consequence is that generally British society has been extremely comfortable, perhaps that's the wrong word, but accepting of casualties. In the Falklands operation, we had 7 ships sunk, and it just goes through on the nod. My regiment, we have Second World War casualty rates. The only difference is there's less dead and more wounded because the medicine's better, and it was very cold and a lot of blood coagulating. But that's why it was like that. We were very nearly, if the Argentinians had fought on, we'd be running out of blokes. My regiment had 225 casualties in 1,200 people. And as usual, a lot of that's leaders and so forth. So that that went through, that was all right. We've got an army. You know, it's great. You join the army, that's the game. Off we go. Post-Iraq, the soldier has become a victim. And he is the consequence of your political decision, sort of argument that goes through. And that's where I think it's vulnerable, and I suspect if I go to on the streets here, I find much the same sentiment.
Sure. It sounds like, and if I can articulate this right, it sounds like there's a situation that you describe, and I'm thinking about your tour of duty over in The Hague. Is that where you were?
In The Hague?
For the United Nations?
No, that was in Sarajevo.
Okay. But anyway,
I think the Dutch would have been rather upset if...
so there's a disconnect between political objective and how it translates into the use of force by a military unit. And I'm just interested in your experience on how the political objective may have been articulated and then provided to the military unit.
Okay.
And then is there an opportunity for the military unit to
Yes.
articulate back up the chain of command, so to speak, to say, hey, we can do this, but we can't do that? I don't know if I'm articulating.
No, you're absolutely correct. It's a perfectly good question. I'm hesitating slightly because at the risk of boring everyone, I can't answer it without producing a little history. And I would take another point and say, you're asking about a very complex situation. If this was just a national matter, it wouldn't be any easier to do, but it would be simpler to do. The situation that you're referring to in the business that leads us to Bosnia and Sarajevo and the disasters at Srebrenica and so forth are, in a nutshell, is that the Yugoslavia, as we knew it under Tito, had collapsed into its ethnic groupings. And there was fighting within the new states, which were the provinces of Tito's Yugoslavia, which had different ethnic groups in it. And the European Union were in danger of becoming part of the problem in that they recognised states before they were ready to be states, and this aggravated matters. And it quickly became a UN operation. The trouble was, there was no consensus within the Security Council, and this wasn't a Russian-Chinese blocking move. There was no consensus in the Security Council as to what the desirable outcome was, and whether armed force had any role in achieving that desirable outcome. And there was a very divided council. Watch this space over Ukraine and Russia. So you settled for the lowest common denominator that the international community through the UN could accept. Uncle Sam isn't in this game except in the Security Council at this stage. And it was seen as a European problem. Europeans get on with it. And the UN became the agency that collected all the European and other nations' efforts into dealing with this matter. And the most that anyone could accept is that armed force could be used as self-defense of that particular soldier at that particular time. And there was nothing preemptive about it at all. It was purely like a police force in reaction to being attacked. And secondly, that the object of the UN was to ameliorate the consequences of the fighting, to deliver blankets, food, get the water running again, etc., etc. And the military force was there to protect those doing those good things. So that was where it all settled, and that was what people were doing to start with. In the middle of a three-cornered fight going on the streets around. It slowly gets worse, and more on the screens. And we get to the classic case of something must be done. And something that could be done, driven largely by Uncle Sam, was that we would stop the air attacks by the Serbs on these columns of refugees and so forth. And so came into being a no-fly zone by NATO. And I'm in the Ministry of Defence in London, and I am one awful week while this debate was going on, I flew across the Atlantic 3 times, both ways, 6 flights across. 8 days later, I could barely stand. And this was going to the Security Council, back to the North Atlantic Council, and so forth. Because we were about to commit the most elementary organisational howler that if you'd suggested it in any war college, in any first world country, let alone any others, you'd have been given 2 aspirins and told to totter off over there and try another year. Because we were about to create a situation where you had one political body, NATO, with its force, superimposed on another political body, the UN, with its force, in and over the same space, with different objectives. One was to shoot down Serb aeroplanes, and the others were delivering blankets. And were hostages to fortune, if the moment a Serb aeroplane got shot down, why don't I shoot that brick? And so we created this immensely stupid plan and carried on with it. And it got harder and harder because we did it again. We took the no-fly zone idea and decided we were now going to have safe areas. The bill to defend a safe area was worked out by the military staffs, and I'm in the MOD, I see the UN staff's figures. They looked good figures to me. I had people run over but no, that's about right, boss. My American opposite numbers, my French opposite numbers were all saying, no, it's about what it is. You needed another 48,000 soldiers if you want to defend that lot. And remember, they're all inside Serb territory. So you had air problems and so forth. Nobody was prepared to pay the bill. So the Security Council said, we'll have safe areas. And NATO will bomb people if they're offended, if they're attacked and everything like that. But otherwise, that's all we do. And quote, I'm quoting now from the Security Council resolution, deter by our presence. So dropped into these enclaves were small groupings of roughly battalion strength, and were deterring by their presence. But by being there, they became hostages to those who surrounded them. They became hostages to those who were inside the enclave as well, because they were at war with the people on the outside. So we created a situation that I called, what I came to command in '95, a hostage and shield. That force in that enclave became a hostage, and I won't let food through to you, and so on and so forth. Or you were a shield, so I can attack out from my enclave and kill Fred over there, but he won't be able to counterattack because the shield is in the way. And that's what was happening. Now, taking command at that point, I want to fight or go. I have no political direction. It's all gone. And eventually, after trying to do it by bombing, where we finished up with 380 hostages, which caused all my authorities to be taken away, back to New York, not allowed to use force. We then, 6 weeks, 2 months later, have Srebrenica. And then I'm given the keys back. And about a month later, the opportunity arrived. And you know what happened. We started shelling, and I'd got a force together by that time. And although it's all written up as NATO air attacks, the artillery group I had, which we sort of got in there, fired over 2,500 rounds during that bit of operation, and destroyed the Serb artillery. And once you've done that, we were able to lift the siege, which had gone on for nearly 2 years.
You were a British officer assigned to the UN or NATO?
No, I'm a UN officer.
UN, okay, so how does that work with the relationship? UN says we need X force to accomplish X
Security Council
objectives.
will agree this grand plan, and in those days they've amalgamated some of the departments now, but in those days it was the Department of Peacekeeping, would then call to the nations, and the nations would supply. And usually you want some fairly light rifle battalions to police the street in X and so forth, or stand on the line between two forces that have agreed to peace. The whole construct until this day, we're talking about this day, of peacekeeping was that the warring parties had agreed to stop fighting. And what they needed was a line of people between them to guarantee that the other lot wasn't going to pull a fast one. And broadly, you can see that happening on the Golan Heights. That UN deployment is still there.
So
it's
those-
agreed every 6
The
months.
white vehicles and the blue helmets.
Yep. And you have the same, that's what we had in Bosnia. You are not part of the fight. You're there for whatever role it is. Now, for good or ill, we signed up for that. But it was, in my view, we failed to understand that if you're just there delivering blankets, fine. then just deliver blankets. Don't start being an anti-aircraft force or anything else, because you creep into this disaster. And it's jolly difficult to get it to change. I'd have been sacked if it hadn't been for Srebrenica being so awful that people were prepared for me to just not ask for permission. I just did it. And a lot of people got very upset. But if you call Smith, there's lots of others who slide it onto. I'm sorry.
Yeah, sir, so what was the chain of command structure between NATO and the UN, and then who developed the ROE?
Well, here's one of the friction. The chain of command didn't come together until you reached the North Atlantic Council on one hand and the Security Council on the other. It did come together because the likes of R. Smith here knew Admiral Snuffy Smith in Naples and Mike Ryan up at the, wherever the aircraft was, I've forgotten where that is in Italy, but he was up there, and I knew both of them. And so there was a conversation, this was, unofficial. It got better as after Srebrenica. And but basically, the two Smiths had got fed up with it, and I didn't care. I was just going to, as soon as I got a chance, I was going to start a fight.
This passion that you have for this subject, how do you
Keep going, I just need a drink. So how do
you continue to work in the field?
Well, I find it very stimulating. I mean, I find operations exciting. It isn't a nice thing in many ways, but it is jolly exciting. And you're rolling the dice.
Just hoping you make a difference somehow.
Oh yes, no, I do more than hope. I try. No, it's not, and you're sitting. I mean, it's one thing when it's. I mean, it was just as exciting when it was. I'm commanding my platoon or company in somewhere else, but you're not sitting on this interface between, in my terms of my thesis, the confrontation and the conflict. You're managing that interface, and by understanding it in those two piles, I found it a way of managing that situation. What was military, what was battle, and what was the confrontation.
I'm about the same age as you, and I'm constantly talking to my family and children. And there's been war in our lives. There will always be.
I think it's part of the human nature. We like fighting. And it can be very frightening, and you wish you weren't there on other occasions. But we do like it, and we sublimate this with most of our sports. Ask yourself, why are the majority, not all by any means, but why are the majority of the adversarial sports, why did they originate in England? What is it about the English that they had to invent these games? And when it wasn't the English, it tended to be a strip of people that lived on the Atlantic seaboard between the Basque Country and up into Ireland. And why is it that?
I knew a German man once who said, "You are responsible for all the world's problems."
What, the English? Certainly. I'll hold my hand up, yeah. And with the Europeans after that. It's the Europeans who've gone around disturbing everyone else for the last 400 years. No, but I think we do actually find this, if you like, the excitement, the challenge of a fight, and we've embedded in our society. And we follow our teams, don't we? And spend a lot of money in order to be there for that match or whatever.
So speaking of the Europeans, since you brought it up, I've been sort of tossing it over in my mind, and I wonder if we could get back to the conflict in Ukraine. And I know you gave a couple of examples, sort of tying it to the new paradigm. But to me, I think, maybe some of that is just mistakes that Putin has made. But it just seems to me that what's going on in the Ukraine now is more similar to the old paradigm than it is to the new. So I wondered if you could...
Would I agree with you? No.
Okay.
By my analysis, based on what I've said, we have a conflict in Ukraine without any question. We have a confrontation going on. Let me step back a bit. Up until 2014, there was a confrontation between the Kremlin, Putin, and Kiev, because in the Russian mind, they don't believe they have defensible borders. Their understanding of their security is to control the people who live on the other side of their borders. And this would explain the Warsaw Pact to you. They understand this control as a direct reflection of their security. And Ukraine is a particular worry. By the by, in the Slavic languages, the Ukraina in the Balkans was defended localities by Serbs who'd escaped from the Ottomans, and they were planted by the Austro-Hungarians in these critical patches along the border as defended localities. And the word Krajina means a defended border, our border, whatever, and Ukraine has the same base in the language. And it's very close to Moscow. And so the losing Ukraine from their control is an existential problem for the man in the Kremlin, as are the Baltic states. The moment you're through the Baltic states, it's Vilnius, Smolensk, and you're into Moscow. And this really bothers him, and always has. This is deep in Russia. This is Tsarist and so forth. On that rationale, there's been a confrontation from certainly the beginning of the century and Ukraine over who's in charge. And this is largely done by bribing the oligarchs and so forth. And the Russians more or less had control of this until the Maidan riots and so forth, which was all about Ukraine, a big chunk of Ukraine, people wanting to join the European Union, and Moscow not wanting that. Had nothing to do with NATO at that stage. This was all about prosperity for the people by joining the European Union. And it's at that point that Putin seizes Crimea, relatively easy to do, population was Russian largely, they had a military base in Sevastopol and so forth, and sparked a resistance, a revolution in the Donbass area, which again was primarily Russian-based, planted people during the Soviet and pre-Soviet period. And you reach the situation that was there this time last year. And the confrontation still continued, and the fighting between the militias in the Donbass and the Ukrainians had been continuing for some, since 2014. So that's that confrontation. This then, to everyone's surprise except the intelligence community, becomes a conflict in which, yes, the Russian army tried to do it the old way. And for reasons argued like, you can't do that anymore because there's these things in the sky and you've got missiles and so forth. It won't work. And if you can't get off the roads, then your logistics will completely fail. And they did. And so that failed. Now, at that point, we start a confrontation at another level. From 14, we've had a confrontation, we, the West, and I'll use the Russian word for us, the collective West, which covers EU, NATO, and everybody else that we don't like. The collective West were in confrontation with Russia from 14. We ramped up the confrontation in a big way in February, and it stayed up there, and we've been supporting Ukraine more or less, depending on the country in question. That confrontation continues, and for Putin, that is as much the object of his war as Ukraine, because his greatest group of enemies, if you like, and the people who squashed him back into close to Moscow, are the collective West. And his biggest fear is the European Union, because he knows the thing that defeated Russia last time was the Warsaw Pact, with their televisions, able to see what life was like under a different arrangement. And very slowly, it collapsed, until in a big rush, the wall comes down and all the rest of it. And Putin knows, because he was on the ground then, that it wasn't the military that made the difference. It was prosperity. And that's what he's frightened about. That's why he's upset about the EU. And he talks NATO, and he hates the Americans. But it really fears, politically, he fears the European Union and the prospect of prosperity.
But is there a new sense that the utility of force is back in the game in the old way? That they are fighting it out on the battlefield, and given that nature of the confrontation, what's gonna drive a resolution, it's going to be force.
In the revolution in Moscow, you mean?
Well, I mean, one way or the other, whether Putin gets removed, and I mean, I don't know what that's going to mean. I mean, I'm not sure that there's any strong liberals waiting in the wings in Russia to do anything different. But so I think that. But sir, I mean,
the fighting.
You're running through some of these circumstances, and I'm thinking, wow, that sounds a lot like the origins of World War II.
Yes, it is.
And some of the concerns that were there, and there was a confrontation going on, but it got down to force, the utility of force.
The utility of force in the end, 6 years later, leaves a leveled Germany, occupation, Warsaw Pact, and everything else. And we can say that was a good use of force, because we won. But the whole of our societies were committed to that and suffered. Nothing in the terms of prosperity and so forth do you watch the graphs, and the period from 14 till about the 60s is one long flat or falling line, except for the arms industry. So I'm not sure you can make that comparison in the sense, yes, we won, we did away with Hitler, the Japanese and all the rest of it, marvellous. And we put in place a world order, the United Nations and so forth, the rule of law and so on. That has been comprehensively trashed by Putin. We weren't doing very well with it for the last 30 years, but is now blown away by what Putin has done. Invaded another country, completely stalled the United Nations, blah, blah, blah. And so there's a third level confrontation, I suggest a second level, the confrontation between the collective West, but there's a global one. How do you want to run the world? Are we going to go back to a situation where the strongest wins? And we just accept that? Do we do that? Or are we going to, especially with the face of things like climate change and so forth, or do we want to arrive at some way of conducting our global business in which you do not invade Ukraine and get away with it? And that, to me, is the fundamental of the confrontations for the long duration. And I don't see any of our capitals at the moment. They're busy wanting Ukraine to win and will do everything they can afford to do that. That I'm quite confident, particularly in Europe. There's a very, very strong anti-Russian and pro-Ukraine statement in all their political parties. What Putin is going to exploit this winter, I think, is that the sanctions that everybody's applied are generally to the advantage of the United States commercially, and completely the opposite way round in Europe. And the pain of the sanctions is going to be unfairly felt, and Putin will seek to exploit that crack in the strength of it. And the energy and cost of living problems within the European economies will also be exploited because they are much more dangerous for the more southern European economies than for the northern ones. So he will seek to exploit that weakness while he uses the winter to reform his army. And he's holding 15% or so of Ukrainian territory. Now, even if you discount the Crimea and the Donbass, he's still holding a lot of Ukraine that he shouldn't be. And I don't know who's going to tell the Ukrainians they can't have it back. And so we're going to have to arm them, keep them in the fight, improve their ability to do that. But at the same time, in that conflict, we must be conscious of what we want as an outcome in the confrontation. And I don't think we have a clue. I don't really hear any debate about this as to what is the desired outcome. We can all say we'd like to see Ukraine in its borders, free to trade, and so on and so forth. But that isn't going to, that can't happen in isolation. So what is the relationship with Russia? And that brings me back to this, are we in competition? In which case, with what? For what? Are we opposed? I don't think we know.
But we are arming
I'll come back.
But we're arming the Ukrainians to drive forward a resolution based on force.
Yes.
On the use of force.
Yes.
And so we're
Yes.
back to the old
But
paradigm.
No, we're not.
Well-
That is a battle. It's a big battle. And they're not winning it at the moment. And we'd like them to win. But it is just a battle within this greater whole. And you don't win that battle in such a way, get it wrong, and you will not have a satisfactory outcome to the confrontation. This is just the same on a mega scale as that young officer in Afghanistan who finds himself ambushed. He has a hell of a fight, and he wants all the help he can get, and then come in the Apaches and so forth. Marvellous. But if he shoots up the wrong thing, you've started to adversely affect the confrontation. And we're in exactly that state with Ukraine. I admit, on a big scale. But if you look at, and again in the book, I have this idea of the level of the fight. And again, it's pre the book. This is me thinking as a senior officer. And it really matters where the level of the fight is, because above that is the confrontation. Below that is the fight. Now, take somewhere like Northern Ireland. We might have 20,000 soldiers there, but the size of the fights were 4 men, nothing more. So I, as the commander at the time, I understood my force and my commanders and so forth as doing the confrontation. It was only those junior NCOs and young officers who were in the battle. And you briefed those subordinate commanders who were in the confrontation. You expected them to achieve quite different objectives. And I used to ask the question of NATO. You had corps worth of soldiers from all the nations in Afghanistan. And yet I couldn't find a fight bigger than a heavily reinforced company. So what were all those headquarters doing above that company commander? Okay, we'll buy in the next level up as part of the fight. But what about the brigades and the divisions and all the other headquarters? What were they doing? And I suspect they were managing their force. They weren't part of winning the confrontation. And that's where the difference is. And Zelensky and his officials are very, I think, by what I hear and read of him, are very conscious of this, that their fight is part of something else. And he's very good at particularly appealing to the Europeans that, you know, I'm part of Europe, this could happen to you tomorrow, well done the Finns, join NATO, and so forth. And he's making sure all the time that he's got the supporters, as it were, in the confrontation. Because at some point, someone's going to start to say to him, you can't go on like this. You've got quite a lot of it back. Let's go and do a deal. Or we'll turn the missiles off. I don't know when that is, but that'll happen soon. And it'll be ugly.
General Smith, the issue is provocation, which I think is one of the most misunderstood from the military practitioner's perspective, as well as senior defense officials. In your book, you talk about the propaganda of the deed. How does that play out at the tactical, all the way up to the strategic level, and what is its relation to the utility of force?
How long have you guys got? I'm about to go to anarchism, Trotsky.
Go ahead.
Trotsky is my hero. The cat's called Trotsky as well. How much propaganda of the deed? How much know where this all comes from? Okay, brief, I promise. The anarchists and the whole body of the Russian revolutionaries, realizing they couldn't take this lot head on, came up with a three-pronged strategy. And Mao picks it up and all the others do. And it had 3 legs to it. And you have to do all 3 at the same time. And the first of the legs, and it's not in any order, just the order I'm speaking of, it was the propaganda of the deed. That you, by doing something, you create an identity, that people pay attention to, that you are now an item that has to be dealt with. And so you instructed your cadres and so forth to get out there, kill the postmaster, rob the bank, etc., etc. And it was in the name of the movement or whatever it was. And so you began to establish a purpose, an identity, that you were your victimhood was the cause of all this, etc., etc. Then you had after the propaganda of the deed, you had the process. I've lost my memory now. I've lost the name of it. But the object was that you began to get the other force to overreact. The strategy of provocation is its word. So you created situations, often to the loss of your foot soldiers, but you created situations where you present your opponent as the bully, as overreacting to, and this gathered you sympathy on the street, it gathered you sympathy politically elsewhere. So you've got the strategy of provocation, provoke the problem, provoke it, the propaganda of the deed go hand in hand. And then you have the strategy of the erosion of the will, where you keep on doing this. There he's doing an old trick of calling all those who are not in Russia Nazis. And therefore you can have filtration camps and ethnically cleanse them and so forth. Okay?
Well, that's one of the reasons.
You've labelled them.
That's one of the reasons he has to turn to the Asiatic population.
Yep.
Within.
Yeah.
I have a friend of mine who just spent 3 months in Asia,
Yeah.
former SSRs. They're very anti-war there too.
Are you done?
And it's a religious thing. You know, the mother church of the Russian Orthodox
Yep.
is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. That's a schism.
Yep.
There's sort of a respect for there, even for the more conservative Russians who are religious.
Yes. But that, if I'm right, the Ukrainian church is now formally broken away as a result of this invasion.
You know, it's the Ukrainian church is its own. Russia's in a hard part. You get into the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. They're either Catholic or Lutheran.
Mm.
You get to parts of Ukraine, they're Ukrainian Catholics. Azerbaijan is Muslim, and the Georgians and Armenians have their own Orthodox churches, which is separate. The Russians stand there, but the only one which they have a bind with is the Ukrainian church.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
I think that eats a lot, plus the fact the social contact between Ukrainians and Ukrainian, half Ukrainian, living in Russia, especially among the younger people, those of military age, throughout Soviet Union, before Russia now, is tight. It's been very close, that bond between those two groups. I think that affects the effectiveness of the Russian soldiers going in. It's, to them, I think it's family.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have time for one more question, and certainly we'll give some time after the session is over with to engage with General Sir Rupert Smith on an individual basis. I think other questions out there?
Prodding of chests.
So as a kid, did you always want to grow up and be in the military? Did you come from a military family? And were you an unconventional kid out there fighting battles with other kids, or trailblazing then?
Yes, yes to almost all of that. I was a very bad student in every sense of the word, and was cold and hungry one day in a place called Reading, and I joined the army. I did come from a military family, My father was a RAF officer, and this is an accident of history because of the wars, as it were, going backwards to. But my family have been either sailors or soldiers or airmen way back to about 1830s that we can trace. And then they were criminals transporting to Australia. So that's yes. But mostly, I was cold and hungry and ready.
And do you write poetry, or you appreciate was this more
I do
about?
enjoy poetry.
I just got this out of the library down the street, right before I came here, so I haven't looked at it yet. You're both poets of the World War I, but so I'm looking forward to looking into it. But do you write poetry, or you?
I don't write it, for goodness sake, no.
Oh.
When on operations and things, I always take poetry with me because there's always something to read that matches what's going on around you. And the best anthology is the one actually collected by another general called Other Men's Flowers, if you ever come across it. And it's got a terrific mixture of all very old poems. It's not modern at all. He died shortly after the Second World War.
So your book is available for sale out at
The second edition, madam, is demanding you to buy it in the bookshops. Mr. Amazon will also supply it at a special price.
So you won't be here to sign it?
I will be here until Friday, or is it Saturday?
Do you have them out at the War College?
Bonnie, I have one copy here. I'll provide you a complimentary copy, so General Sir Rupert Smith can inscribe your book.
We have a thing going here.
I would like to, if I could piggyback on that question. There's a wonderful supplier. The book is published by Penguin Press, United Kingdom. If you go to their website, you have several shops you can buy it from the United Kingdom. I have had the best luck from Blackwells, and the shipping is free. So I think that's a good route to take.
We can't sell, for some reason to do with the publishing world. It won't, no one will sell it, the second edition in this country. I've lost, I've just given up. But the UK bookshops, as I said, will ship it free.
I invite you all to engage with General Sir Rupert Smith. I would like to, if everybody could show a round of applause.
Thank you all very much, and the best of luck in changing the institutions.
General Smith, you just brought us on an incredible journey, which brings us to tomorrow evening and Friday as well. And thank you for that incredible, insightful presentation and dialogue with the American people here in Carlisle. Tomorrow night we'll be at Dickinson College at the Anita Tolvin Schlechter Auditorium, beginning at 7 p.m. General Smith will be joined by our chair, the symposium chair, Lieutenant General James Dubik, who is here in the room. And it should be a wonderful team approach to even understanding the nature and character of war and the consequences of war to the next level. And I just have to say this, without these two gentlemen, and certainly General Dubik, who's been the chair for over 2 years for the symposium, and shepherding this work, we would not be here tonight. So General Dubik, thank you very much. We're going to take a break during the Veterans Day week, which would be the week of the 7th of November. And so please honor our veterans as you see General Smith and General Dubik wearing their poppies. I frequently travel to the United Kingdom every November. Unfortunately, this year will not be taking place, but I am amazed at the amount of public support that still exists for Remembrance Day. Every year, I believe that they stop at 11 o'clock for 2 minutes, everything stops. And it's the most amazing phenomenon that I was able to witness in the UK. So please remember our veterans and their families next week. And the following week, the week of 14 November, General Dubik will be back with us discussing his book, Just War Reconsidered. And then he'll be followed by Just War and Just Peace on the 16th and 17th. And we're going to take a break during Thanksgiving and Christmas, but we will guarantee we will be back come the new year, and we will continue as long as we are supported by the people of Carlisle. And we just ask you to continue on this journey to understand the nature of war in order to understand the impact of the consequences of war. So again, I thank you very much. Please feel free to engage with General Smith and also General Dubik as well. Thank you very much for coming.
Emails in the back?
Yes, thank you, Katie. On the back table, there's a sign-up sheet if you'd like to put your name there and your email address. We have a distribution list. I will add you to that list. I blind copy everyone, so nobody will see your email address, but you will be updated as we move forward on this journey. Any other questions, administrative questions? And the last but not least, I want to thank our host, Sean Gladden, the Executive Director of the Cumberland County Historical Society. He's a wonderful partner for over 2 years now. Thank you, sir.
Friday here.
And Fridays, yes, thank you very much. So there are 2 sessions, one tomorrow, War Amongst the People, again, General Dubik and General Smith. And then Friday as well, here in this very room, there'll be a social beginning at 6 p.m. as part of that session, and that is on Friday. So please join us for both events. God bless you all. Thank you very much.